He had judged thousands before, but this performance stopped him cold. The Got Talent stage blazed under its constellation of lights, each beam cutting through the darkness like hope itself. The familiar hum of anticipation filled the air as cameras rolled and the audience settled into their seats. Red and blue spotlights danced across the backdrop, illuminating the golden logo that had witnessed dreams rise and fall for years. At the judges' table, Simon Cowell adjusted his collar, his expression set in its trademark mask of professional skepticism. The atmosphere was electric tonight. 3 acts had already graced the stage: a magician who fumbled his finale, a dance crew that brought the house down, and a comedian whose timing was just slightly off. Now, as the curtains parted once more, a different energy filled the space. A 16-year-old boy walked onto the stage with measured steps, his hand trailing along a guide rope that had been quietly installed moments before. His name was Marcus, and everything about his entrance commanded a strange, respectful silence. He wore a simple black suit that seemed too formal for his youth, and his dark hair was neatly combed to one side. But it was his eyes that drew attention, not because of what they saw, but because of what they could. Marcus had been blind since birth. The audience held its collective breath as he made his way to the grand piano. Positioned center stage, his fingers found the bench with practiced precision, and he sat down, adjusting his position with the confidence of someone who had learned to navigate the world through touch and sound alone. Simon leaned forward slightly, his pen already poised above his notepad. He had seen his share of what he privately called sympathy acts, performers whose personal struggles were meant to overshadow their lack of talent. His expression remained neutral, but those who knew him well could detect the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he was preparing to deliver one of his famously direct critiques. "Hello," Marcus said into his microphone, his voice carrying clearly across the vast space. "My name is Marcus, and I'm 16 years old. I've been playing piano since I was 4, and today I'd like to perform something I wrote myself." The host nodded encouragingly. "Tell us a little about yourself, Marcus. What inspired you to come here today?" Marcus paused, his fingers resting lightly on the keys. "Music," he said simply, "is how I see the world. When I lost my sight as a baby due to complications, my mother said music would be my eyes. She was right, but," his voice caught slightly, "she's not here to see this. She passed away 2 years ago." A ripple of sympathy moved through the audience, but Simon's expression remained unchanged. He had heard variations of this story before. The formula was predictable: tragic backstory, emotional setup, mediocre performance, followed by a standing ovation, driven more by pity than genuine appreciation for talent. "This piece," Marcus continued, "is called Mom's Face. It's the only way I can remember what she looked like." Simon's pen stopped moving. Marcus placed his hands on the keys, and the first notes emerged, soft, tentative, like a whisper in the darkness. The melody was simple at first, almost childlike in its innocence. But as his fingers found their rhythm, something extraordinary began to happen. The music wasn't just being played, it was being. Each note seemed to carry weight, emotion, memory. The melody climbed and fell like the cadence of a mother's voice, reading bedtime stories. It swirled and danced like the feeling of being lifted into loving arms. It crescendoed with the warmth of a kiss, good night, and diminished to the gentle rhythm of a lullaby. Simon found himself forgetting to take notes. His usually restless hands grew still. Around him, the other judges sat transfixed, their prepared comments forgotten. The audience had fallen into complete silence, save for the occasional soft sniffle. But it was more than just the music. As Marcus played, his face transformed. His usually careful, measured expression gave way to something raw and unguarded. Tears began to flow down his cheeks, but his fingers never faltered. If anything, they seemed to gain strength from his vulnerability. The composition told a story without words, of a little boy reaching for a mother he couldn't see, of hands that guided him to piano keys when the world seemed impossible to navigate, of a voice that sang him to sleep even when darkness felt overwhelming. It spoke of last conversations in hospital rooms, of promises whispered into the night, of a love that transcended physical presence. As the piece reached its emotional climax, Marcus's playing became almost frantic, as if he were trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. His whole body swayed with the music, completely lost in the memory he was creating and recreating with each measure. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the music gentled. The final movement was tender, accepting, peaceful. It spoke of letting go while holding on, of finding beauty in loss, of discovering that love doesn't end when physical presence does. The last note hung in the air like a prayer. For a moment that felt like eternity, the auditorium was completely silent. Marcus sat at the piano, his hands still on the keys, his chest rising and falling with the effort of what he had just shared. Tears continued to stream down his face, but there was a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Simon realized his own hands were trembling. He looked around the table at his fellow judges. Amanda had tears in her eyes and was pressing a tissue to her lips. Alessia was openly crying, not bothering to hide her emotion. David was staring at Marcus with an expression of pure awe. But it was the audience that truly captured the moment. They remained silent, not out of politeness or uncertainty, but out of reverence. They had just witnessed something sacred, not a performance, but a communion. A young man had opened his heart and shared his most precious memories with strangers, and somehow, in doing so, he had made them all feel less alone. Simon stood up slowly from his chair. His movement broke the spell, and the audience began to stir, us in what was happening. The camera zoomed in on his face, capturing an expression that millions of viewers would remember long after the show ended. His usual confident stride was nowhere to be seen as he walked around the judges' table and onto the stage. Each step seemed deliberate, careful, as if he were walking on holy ground. Marcus, hearing the footsteps, turned his head in Simon's direction, a look of uncertainty crossing his features. "Marcus," Simon said, his voice softer than anyone in the audience had ever heard it. He stopped a few feet from the piano bench, close enough to speak intimately, but far enough to respect the young man's space. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, his voice small and vulnerable in the aftermath of his performance. Simon was quiet for a long moment, struggling with words that didn't seem adequate for what he had just witnessed. "In 30 years of television," he finally said, "I've heard thousands of people sing about love, about loss, about hope. But tonight," he paused, running a hand through his hair in an uncharacteristic gesture of uncertainty. "Tonight, you didn't just play music, you made me see something I've never seen before." The audience was hanging on every word, the cameras capturing every micro-expression on both men's faces. "You made me see your mother," Simon continued, his voice growing stronger. "Through your music, I saw her smile, heard her laugh, felt her love for you. And for a moment, just a moment, I understood what it means to lose someone who is irreplaceable." Marcus's composure finally broke completely. His shoulders shook with silent sobs, and he reached up to wipe his eyes with the back of his hand. Simon took another step closer. "May I?" he asked gently, gesturing toward the space beside the piano bench. Marcus nodded, and Simon sat down beside him on the bench, closer than he had ever been to a contestant during a performance. The sight of the usually untouchable judge sitting shoulder to shoulder with a crying teenager created a moment of pure humanity that transcended television. Your mother, Simon said quietly, his words picked up by Marcus's microphone, would be so proud of what you've become. Not because you're talented, though you are extraordinarily talented, but because you've taken your pain and transformed it into something beautiful. You've taken your loss and made it a gift to others. He paused, looking out at the audience, then back at Marcus. Tonight, you didn't just play for us. You let us into your heart, into your memories, into your love for your mother. That's not just talent, Marcus. That's courage. The audience could no longer contain themselves. They erupted in applause, but it wasn't the usual enthusiastic cheering that followed a good performance. It was something deeper, more respectful, the kind of applause reserved for moments when entertainment becomes art, when performance becomes truth. Simon stood up from the bench, but before returning to the judges' table, he did something that would be replayed on social media for months to come. He placed a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder and leaned down to whisper something in his ear. The cameras couldn't capture the words, but they captured Marcus's reaction, a smile that seemed to light up his entire face, followed by a nod of understanding. As Simon walked back to his seat, the other judges were already on their feet. Without any discussion or deliberation, they all moved toward the golden buzzer simultaneously. But Simon held up a hand, stopping them. No, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone system. This moment doesn't need our validation. Marcus, you've already won something more valuable than any competition could offer. You've shown us what it means to turn sorrow into beauty, isolation into connection, loss into love. He looked directly at Marcus, who was listening intently from the piano bench. But if you'll have us, we'd be honored to help you share that gift with the world. The golden buzzer descended anyway, not from any single judge, but from all of them at once, their hands meeting on the button in a moment of unprecedented unity. Golden confetti filled the air as Marcus sat at the piano, overwhelmed but somehow transformed by what had just happened. As the confetti settled and the audience's cheers finally began to subside, Simon returned to his seat, but his eyes never left Marcus. The young man had found his way back to the piano keys and was playing a soft, impromptu melody. Nothing formal or structured, just the musical equivalent of a deep breath, a moment of peace after an emotional storm. Later, after the cameras stopped rolling and the audience had filed out, Simon lingered on the stage. Marcus was still there, running his fingers over the piano keys in the quiet auditorium, his guide dog now by his side. Marcus, Simon called out softly. The young man turned toward his voice. Mr. Cowell, what I whispered to you earlier, Simon said, walking over to him. I told you that your mother was watching tonight, but I want you to know something else. Marcus waited, his face expectant. Tonight, you didn't just play her memory, you became it. Every note, every emotion, every moment of beauty you shared, that's her legacy living through you. And in that way, she's not really gone at all. Marcus smiled, the kind of smile that comes from deep understanding rather than simple happiness. Thank you, he said, for seeing her. Simon nodded, finding himself oddly emotional again. Thank you for helping the rest of us see her too. As Marcus and his guide dog made their way off the stage, Simon remained behind for a few more minutes, standing in the space where magic had happened. The lights were dimming, the crew was packing up equipment, and the normal sounds of a television production winding down filled the air. But for Simon, the echoes of Marcus's music still lingered. The melody of Mom's face had somehow lodged itself in his memory, and he found himself humming it softly as he finally made his way to the exit. That night, social media exploded with clips of the performance. Mom's face began trending worldwide within hours. Videos of Simon's unprecedented behavior, leaving the judges' table, sitting with a contestant, his visible emotion were shared millions of times across platforms. But perhaps more importantly, the performance inspired thousands of people to share their own stories of loss, of love, of finding beauty in pain. Musicians posted their own tributes to lost loved ones. Families reached out to reconnect with estranged relatives. Support groups for the visually impaired reported an influx of new members seeking community and understanding. Marcus himself became an overnight sensation, but not in the typical reality TV fashion. His story resonated with people on a deeper level. Here was a young man who had taken life's greatest challenges and transformed them into art, who had found a way to make his mother's love visible to the world even though he had never seen her face. 3 months later, Marcus released his first album, Songs for Mom. It debuted at #1 in 12 countries and became the year's best-selling classical crossover album. But more than commercial success, it represented something precious, proof that authentic emotion, genuine talent, and human connection could still triumph in a world often dominated by manufactured entertainment. Simon, for his part, often spoke about that night in interviews. "People ask me about my favorite Got Talent moments," he would say, "and I always tell them about Marcus, not because he was the most technically proficient performer we've ever had, but because he reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place. It's not about perfection, it's about truth." Years later, when Marcus had become an internationally recognized composer and performer, he would still include Mom's face in every concert. And sometimes when he reached the most emotional passage of the piece, he would pause and smile slightly, as if he could hear something the audience couldn't, a mother's voice, still guiding him home through the music they created together. That night on the Got Talent stage had changed everything for Marcus, but it had also changed something fundamental for everyone who witnessed it. It proved that sometimes the most powerful performances come not from what we can see, but from what we choose to share. And in sharing his deepest pain and greatest love, a 16-year-old boy had reminded the world that music, at its core, is simply the language of the human heart, made audible. The show would go on to feature many more talented performers, emotional moments, and memorable performances. But for those who were there that night, the judges, the audience, the crew, and the millions watching at home, Marcus's performance remained something special, a reminder of what television could be when it stopped trying to entertain and simply allowed itself to be human. In the end, that's what made the moment magical. Not the lights, not the cameras, not even the music itself, but the simple act of one person choosing to be completely, vulnerably, beautifully human in front of strangers, and in doing so, he had given them permission to be human too. That night, the world saw not just a judge, but the heart behind the judgment. Not just a farmer, but a son still reaching for his mother's love. Not just a show, but a sacred space where pain became beauty and loss became a gift. The silent pianist had made them all see.